Howard, welcome to the Science of Learning.
Thanks, Keith. It's good to reconnect with you and to connect with your audience.
We use the word intelligence constantly, especially now in discussions of AI, and we talk as if everybody already knows what it means. So when you hear the word intelligence, what do you think people are talking about? And where do you think people misunderstand the word intelligence?
Well, as you know, I've spent half of my life thinking about this issue, and even I use the word intelligence or smart casually. I'll meet somebody and I'll say to my wife, he's not very smart, or that kid is really very intelligent. So it's a lay term that's been used for centuries. But within the learning sciences, intelligence picked up a more technical meaning about a century ago when the first IQ tests were developed. And as many of your listeners will know, the original tests were created by Alfred Binet, who was a French psychologist, and he wanted to predict which kids would have trouble in the French public schools. And he was very shrewd, and he came up with a bunch of questions which you could ask in half an hour or so. And if the kids did well in those questions, he said, well, they'll probably do okay in school. If the kids had lots of problems with those questions, he'd say, well, those kids may need some special attention. And I have no problem with that particular approach. But especially in the United States, over the last century, we've come to really venerate and lionize the so-called IQ test, which for many of us now is the SAT or some other ETS-generated test, which goes for an hour or two and asks a whole bunch of questions and then comes up with a characterization of how smart you are. If you said, well, does that predict who will do well in college? I would say it probably predicts better than many other indices. But once we begin to move from a prediction about a certain kind of behavior to how a person will do in life, with the many opportunities and the many threats and the many challenges and the many different avenues, then the word intelligence becomes much too bloated. It carries a weight that it doesn't deserve. And if your podcast audience knows anything about me, they know that over 40 years ago, I developed a theory called the theory of multiple intelligences. And in a sentence that claims that human beings have 6, 7, 8, 9 relatively different faculties. Faculties means capacities, and you can be strong in one, average in the second, and very poor in the third, or vice versa. And any notion that if you're good with language, that means you're good with spatial abilities, or you're good with mathematical abilities, or you're good with musical abilities, or you're good in understanding other people, or you're good in being able to make discriminations among clouds or among rocks or among plants or flowers. Anybody who thinks about it realizes that's absurd. There might be a few people who are good in everything. There might be a few people who are bad in everything, but almost everybody has a quite jagged profile. So I'm going to be blunt here, except for people who are in psychometrics, people who believe in and even worship the IQ test. The rest of the world has already accepted my ideas and those of Dan Goleman, who talked about emotional intelligence, and nowadays they talk about mattering intelligence and financial intelligence. So at a lay conversational, even podcast level, we understand that people have different faculties and that we need to assess those faculties much more focused than you can with a single test. But still, if you went to the Psychometric Society, which you may go to, and you go to the journal Intelligence, you'll find that most people assume that they've cracked the mystery of intelligence. It's simply one capacity. It's probably largely genetic. And let me just tease you, to get into Harvard College in the 19th century, you had to read Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Those were the mastery items. In my day, which was 60 years ago, you had to have some ability in the sciences, some ability in the humanities, some ability in the social sciences. Now, of course, with a vanishing job market and with AI and computer science so salient, people aren't going to care whether you know Latin or Greek. They're not going to care whether you can analyze a Shakespeare sonnet. They're going to want to know how quickly can you code, and can you give some added value to ChatGPT or to Claude or some other AI entity. So once we look at it sociologically, what we consider smart changes radically over time, but not for those people who believe in IQ. They still think it's one test, and if they do it well enough, they'll be able to predict your life chances. But the rest of the world doesn't agree anymore.
Well, you are a cognitive psychologist, which means you're the kind of psychologist that studies what goes on in the mind when people are doing things that require ability or what some people might call intelligence. So if you're looking at what goes on inside the mind, that could be the same sorts of things, whether you're doing Latin or Greek or whether you're doing computer programming. And in your case, if you're looking at different types of things, like it's music or like it's science, or maybe it's spatial, what you're calling abilities or intelligences, you're looking at things that are going on inside the mind. So is that right? So when you're doing what you call a mathematical intelligences, you're looking at the types of things that go on inside the mind, or what I know you've called kinds of mind. So say a little bit more about that.
I don't buy that way of putting it because, it's all neurons, just like in computers, it's all zeros and ones, but that doesn't get you very far. What actually get me to begin to develop multiple intelligence theory was that in 1971, so 55 years ago, I began to work every day in an aphasia ward with individuals who had different kinds of brain damage. The most important thing about brain damage is where it is. Is it in the left hemisphere, in the right hemisphere? Is it anterior? Is it posterior? Is it superficial or is it deep? Is it subcortical, et cetera? And there I learned what people in neurology, neuroscience have known, that the single most important thing about a lesion is where it's located and how penetrating or how punctate it is. And so the notion of cognition is singular, but once you begin to break cognition down, you see that how it's represented in the nervous system and how it's manifested behaviorally in tasks or tests or so on, you see that the notion of a single mind, a single intelligence, a single brain breaks down. Now, most people who are interested in IQ don't care that much about the brain. They do care about genetics because they would like to argue that IQ is genetic. And of course, that's where it becomes very controversial socially, because it evolves rather quickly into racism, even though I think that many people who believe IQ is genetic are not particularly racists. But those of us who don't buy that say, we can only begin to determine whether something is racist if we actually can take people who have different brains, born with different brains, and essentially paint them so they look the same, have them raised in the same environment so there's no particular difference, and have them go to equal schools and so on. And then we'll see, what the genetic capacities are. You and I were talking earlier because even though I knew you a while ago, I would never recognize you. And that's not because we've aged, but because I have prosopagnosia. That's an ability which the name wasn't even known when I was young. It's an inability to recognize faces, and it doesn't seem to correlate with anything else. Now, I think that my father and my brother and my daughter all had it. And if you want to call that stupid, fine, but it's a very specific kind of neuroocular problem, and it doesn't correlate with other things, though I happen to have a raft of visual problems, but that's a different matter. So I guess maybe in the spirit of this podcast, we need to take words like mind and cognition and brain and break them down and not lump them together and say, well, if you're smart, you're smart, or if you have a certain kind of a brain, you have a certain kind of a brain. Indeed, I would say that the history of science over the last 75 years, and the reason that I wrote The Mind's Best Work, which was the first history of cognitive science, was to try to understand the different disciplines, psychology, computer science, anthropology, neurology, philosophy, linguistics, that play in that particular sandbox, to understand the methods that are used and to see, and this I think is at the heart of your podcast, how do these different lenses of the mind work together? So if we understand the language and the brain and the philosophy, we can be much more perceptive, even much more intelligent about what it means when we say cognition or the mind. But just to go back and shut up to your first questions, I mean, we all use words like smart casually, and that's fine. But, if I see a child, let alone my grandchild, and somebody says, well, that child is dumb, I'm going to say, hey, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Have you ever seen what they can do when they're put in a maze? Have you ever looked at what happens when they hear a new melody? Have you ever tried to teach them how to putt in golf? Let's break that down and let's see where your label works and where it doesn't.
You mentioned some of your early research, which was with brain damaged patients, I think as early as the 1960s, certainly the 1970s. And then you were perhaps the first person to study the cognitive psychology of the arts, people engaged in the arts and children developing artistic ability in the 1970s. And then, of course, the first book about the cognitive sciences. And how has your understanding of human ability and human intelligence, how has that developed and changed over these decades? How do you think about it now compared to how you thought about it back then?
Well, let me go back to the arts because that's very important and very close to my heart. I've already implied that I was musical. I was a young pianist. I perhaps could have been a prodigy, but that wasn't something anybody, including me, wanted. And then I went on into school and I was a decent student, but especially when I was finishing my education and had a time to travel abroad, I became very interested in the arts. Even though I have lots of visual problems, I became very interested in the visual arts. And one of the most surprising aspects of my autobiography is I spent 15 or 20 years on the board of the Museum of Modern Art, which is certainly unusual for somebody who's colorblind and more musical than they are anything else. But when I began to study cognition as a beginning doctoral student in the middle 1960s, I was a student of Roger Brown, Jerome Bruner. These are people whom you would know. And I was a follower of Jean Piaget, and probably most people who are attending to this podcast have heard of Piaget. I realized that for all these people who were brilliant on any definition and well-intentioned, for them to be developed meant to be able to think like a scientist. And I had spent a lot of time with the arts, theater. I loved and still love theater. As I said, music, painting, sculpture. My wife, whom you know, has taken her art back again after 50 years. She's become a watercolorist. This is Ellen Winter. I said, let's think about what development means if you weren't going to try to become Einstein or Newton or Galileo or maybe even Darwin, but if you were going to try to become an artist instead, Mozart or Leonardo or Picasso or Tennessee Williams or Emily Dickinson, what would development look like then? And the term we use is if the end state of development was not becoming a scientist like Piaget, but rather an artist, how do we think about development? What are the early stages? What are the things that people move along? What are the different kinds of obstacles which can keep you from becoming an artist and so on? And then I published in 1973, so if my math is right, that's 53 years ago, a book called The Arts in Human Development. It was the book of a young person. I will admit that. I was just turning 30. But the question I raised was an important one. If we thought about all of us not as simply smarter or dumber versions of Darwin or of of Galileo, but if we thought about us as individuals who could either create or understand or critique or enjoy the art forms, what would the story of artistic development be? And I laid that out as a platform and as a plan. What had happened 7 years earlier, in late 60s, is I met a philosopher named Nelson Goodman, a very, very eminent philosopher, and he was interested in artistic thinking from the point of view of philosophy. And he had reached a conclusion that was analogous to mine. Why in school do we spend so much time getting people to be scientists or mathematicians, but so little time getting them to develop their artistic abilities and sensitivities and sensibilities. It was helped by the fact that he ran an art gallery and his wife was a painter. But he said, we want to start a research entity which looks as artistic education seriously, artistic knowledge. And this is exactly in 1967, so 59 years ago. Nelson Goodman moved to the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, and he started something called Project Zero. And a young cognitive computer scientist named David Perkins, who'd been a student of Seymour Papert, who was one of the founders of AI. David and I were the first research assistants in Project Zero. And if you'd ask us what Project Zero was in the late 60s, you would have said it's a group of scholars and thinkers who want to understand artistic cognition, artistic development, artistic knowledge, artistic sensitivity. And in 1971, so just 4 years later, Nelson said, well, guys, we were two men, and we started Project Zero. I'm ready to retire. You guys can take it on if you want to. And in something which may be historically the most important thing I've ever done, Dave Perkins and I said, well, we'll try to co-direct Project Zero. And we did that until 2000. I met my wife, Ellen Winter, there in 1973. And as you know, she's now possibly the leading student of artistic development in the world, because she took stuff that we were doing about painting and metaphor and stories and so on and really moved it into second gear. And for her sins, Ellen has not only taken up watercoloring, but she's done a mammoth study of the impact of Project Zero ideas. If you go online or to Amazon, there's what we call the Project Zero Impact Report, where Ellen has traced the effect of Project Zero, which goes well beyond the arts now, but it began in the arts all over the world as she quips on all the continents except Antarctica. And you can read there about how educators and principals and masters in many different countries have used the ideas of Project Zero, which came from David's work, from my work, from Ellen's work, and now dozens of other scholars who are interested in artistry, but also interested in the mind more generally. And I always say about Project Zero, we develop ideas in education and we give them a push in the right direction. That means we don't develop curriculum, we don't develop schools, but we help teachers and principals and curriculum designers do things which will be effective for young children everywhere. And when Project Zero celebrated its 50th anniversary, which was 9 years ago, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was your mentor and my friend, came to celebrate Project Zero, and he gave a wonderful lecture about creativity. What's interesting, and I can say this because I love Mike, he was already beginning to decline, but his lecture was pitch perfect. I think he'd probably given it a few times before, and I hope it was recorded because it was one of the last times that he was available publicly. And just as a footnote, I knew Mike for many, many years, but in 1995, which is 30 years ago, Mike and I and Bill Damon, who is also a psychologist, spent a year at the Center for Advanced Study in California, and we formed a real intellectual and personal bonding, which existed as long as Mike was alive and existed till this week when we honored Bill Damon on his retirement. And there we began studies which began then, but which continue until this day, on what it means to do good work and to be a good citizen. Because we were very worried about creativity unconnected to issues of morality and ethics. In fact, we originally called our study Humane Creativity because Mike and I were both very interested in creativity. Bill is the world's expert in morality and humaneness. How can you bring them together? And this leads to the issue that I know you want to talk about, AI, because AI can be very intelligent, perhaps it can be very creative, but where's the conscience of AI? Where are the controls to keep AI from just blowing up the planet or the solar system? We don't know. And so even though we were not even thinking about AI in those days, we were worried about creativity untethered from the sense of responsibility.
Right. Creativity has always been Important in your research, of course, in Project Zero in the 1970s with cognition and the arts, and then in 1983 with Frames of Mind, your first multiple intelligences book, and then Creating Minds in 1993, which I know very well. In that book, you connected your multiple intelligences theory with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's systems model. And that was when I was in graduate school doing my PhD with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So, of course, I read that book very closely. So, thank you for writing that book. Actually, that's a question I wanted to ask you. How would you connect your creativity work and your intelligence work? You already started to answer that in your last comments, but could you say a little bit more about that, the creativity intelligence connection?
Sure. We might say the intelligence is our computers. And people who believe in IQ think there's just one computer. Howard Gardner thinks there's a musical computer, a linguistic computer, and so on. And I think it's right to call people intelligent if they have a computer that learns easily and works well. That's entirely different than creativity. At the risk of being a bit of a caricaturist, I would say for those of us who are listening to this podcast, creativity in our sense really began with the Renaissance. With the times of Leonardo and Galileo and Michelangelo, where you weren't just expected to be very good at something, but you were expected to do something new, something iconoclastic, something which exploded the controls and the chains. And I learned this firsthand when Ellen and I and our son Benjamin spent a lot of time in China in the 1980s, because China is certainly a great culture, but the notion of China in those days being creative, trying to do new things rather than just perfect what had already been done ever since Confucius or ever since the Sung dynasty, was not an easy concept to be mastered. And in fact, a book that I wrote called To Open Minds, Chinese Clues to Creativity, was a discussion of the very different views of creativity which we've had in the West, Europe, the United States, places that are influenced by that, as opposed to Confucian society, where you really just to take what's already been done and change it a little bit, tweak it a little bit, make it a little bit better, but you don't try to be revolutionary. So what I did in Creating Minds, as you know, was to pick 7 people who, each of whom embodied one of my then 7 intelligences. I've since added one, the naturalist intelligence, and clearly Darwin would have been the one who I would have portrayed there. In fact, it was thinking about Darwin that made me realize that we ought to look into the possibility of a naturalist. But I picked people like Freud and Gandhi and Virginia Woolf and Martha Graham and Freud, and tried to understand the nature of their creativity, what they did that was iconoclastic, that sort of erupted the norms. And I think it was a good book for its time. As I say, it's over 30 years old. But I had a wonderful conversation with a well-known artist a couple of months ago. I won't mention his name because I don't have permission to do so. But he raised a wonderful question, a question that I'd like to hear your answer to, as well as my answer. He said, Howard, if we're writing Creating Minds in the 21st century, whom would you write about? And I realized that I had a very 20th century view of the arts and the sciences and even politics. But if living in the age of AI and computer science and social media, who are the, or all kinds of financial instruments I don't even understand. And there are people who look at a million figures each day and then decide where to invest or sell. I don't really have a way of thinking about that kind of creativity. I don't even have a way of thinking about the kind of creativity that it takes to improve an AI entity. So my book, even if you like it, was a good book, but it was a period book. It was a period book about America and Europe in the 20th century, and the extent to which it would be relevant in the 21st century in the world of commerce and finance and computing. Could Elon Musk avoid being in the book? I doubt it. And same thing for extra credit. I wrote a book called Leading Minds, in which I studied a bunch of leaders from the 20th century. And again, I think it was a good book of its time. But I mean, Donald Trump is a leader now. I didn't have any technology or scholarship to explain how he acquired and what kind of leadership he has. I like to quip that he has social media intelligence, because he's obviously very good at picking out the latest social media and communicating it. But I think the serious point here, Keith, is when you study things like leadership and creativity, you have to be aware that you're studying it at a certain time, in a certain place, when certain people are icons. When we've done a study recently of kids all over the world, whom do you admire the most? The answer was clear: Elon Musk. Now, I don't admire Elon Musk. I think he's damaging. But I have to pay attention to the fact that kids all over the world admire him. And when I asked Chinese teachers 10 or 15 years ago, what leader in the world do you admire the most, but you can't mention the leader of China or the leader of the United States, their answer was Putin. And again, that surprised me, but I can't say they were lying. I can say for their world, it was Putin. And of course, you and I are talking in the middle of May 2026, and Putin is now visiting Xi Jinping. So maybe they knew that, maybe those teachers knew more than I did. So here's a really important point. Even scholarship it's restricted by the particular time and the particular, might even say, news feed that we have. And if I were studying creativity or leadership now, I would study it differently than I did 50 years ago. In the arts, of course, is something you're interested in even more than I am, and that is, what's AI going to do to the arts? I mean, the cover story in the New York Times today is somebody who wrote a book which was very well received on this topic, and now it turns out half the quotations were made up. And they went back to the people who gave them and said, we never said that. How do we think about creativity when a book manages to get published by a major publisher on that topic, and it turns out to be AI or generated? What do you think?
Well, the book that you were just discussing, Creating Minds, I think there was a generalizable finding, and I wonder what you think of this. You talked about the sociocultural specificity of it, and yes, the 7 exceptional creators that you picked were all 20th century people, and but what I took away from it is that each one of them was a different intelligence that they were exceptionally good at, but also using Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's systems model, where there's a domain or a discipline that each of them is exceptionally good in. So I see that each one of the intelligences goes with or aligns with each one of the domains. And that's the broader message I took away, that it seems like there's a parallel between a domain and an intelligence. And I wonder if that's a sociocultural universal, if no matter what historical period you pick, that each intelligence is always going to align with that
well, first
domain.
Of all, thank you for what you said, because while I took it for granted that people would know that the people I selected had different intelligences, that would need to be stated explicitly. I didn't, of course, give them intelligences tests, but there were some people like Picasso who were clearly so much better in one domain than in others that it was clear if they were going to be outstanding, they would be outstanding as visual artists. On the other hand, Stravinsky, who was as eminent in classical music as Picasso was in modern art, Stravinsky didn't compose until he was well into his post-adolescence. He had training as a lawyer, and it was more accidental that he began to work with Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a great composer. And Rimsky, as he was called, said, you ought to think about going into composing instead. And Stravinsky's first work, you probably know, that was known was the Firebird Suite, which was performed in 1910. And it was a work that everybody would like. and everybody would like it today. It was a 19th century work. 3 years later, the first performance of The Rite of Spring, R-I-T-E, in Paris in a major hall, and there he was bombed with fruit and cabbages and hooted off the stage, and people hated it. But from the point of view of a historian, it was there that Stravinsky evolved from being a great 19th century composer to being a path-breaking 20th century composer. And so the issue for creativity is what made Picasso or Stravinsky innovative in their time. And the other people like Martha Graham, the dancer, and T.S. Eliot, we now probably, the poet, we probably accept their work without much resistance. But initially, and Freud was another person, they were condemned, made fun of, and this is something that you, as a student of creativity, know better than anyone else. When you take that step, not just to do something that's going to be popular and liked, but something that's very innovative, you have to have a very tough skin, because the chances that people will just say, "Oh, this is terrific," and it should be taken on forever, that's very unusual. I don't know enough about popular music to be able to talk about the Beatles or about the Stones or even about Bob Dylan, but it would be interesting to know who resisted those 60s artists. I don't think there was anything like the resistance to the people I just mentioned, but I think it was a much smoother transition from the late 50s, from Elvis to the Beatles and the Stones and to Dylan, than it was to Picasso or Stravinsky or Freud, for that matter. I mean, Freud was loathed by the medical profession when he came up with the ideas of psychoanalysis early in the 20th century. So that's the kind of creativity that Mihaly and I were interested in. And as Mihaly taught both of us, you had to have the capacity, the cognition. You had to have the domain, whether it was music or psychiatry, whatever. But then the third notion was the field. The field is the people who decide what sorts of stuff is worth paying attention to and what's not. And unless there's some entity which can say, well, this particular song or this particular painting or this particular poem or this particular AI or this particular solution to climate change really makes sense and is worth taking seriously, it's just going to be ignored, because most new ideas get ignored, probably with good reason. And social media have really complexified the situation, because it's so easy to spread stuff, but a lot of stuff gets spread so that people can criticize it and make fun of it and so on. So how social media takes the role of the domain and makes judgments about what's worth taking seriously and building upon, as opposed to what should be ignored or made fun of, that's a big question. And I'm just remembering, you may remember this better than I did, but with Emily Weinstein, we wrote an article about creativity some years ago, and taking Mike's distinction of C's, we talked about big C creativity, little c creativity, which is kind of what most of us do. And Mike created the word, claimed middle C, because when you ask Mike, was he creative? He said middle C. But Emily and I created the word, the notion of mini C, because mini C is, you make a wisecrack on your feed, and maybe you get a grin from your mother or from your roommate, but it's forgotten. So it hardly counts as a little c, but maybe it counts as a mini c. And the question of interest to sociologists is which things which begin just as a tweet eventually have real wings. And again, that's a question for a younger generation to tackle.
All right. There's a question I've always wanted to ask you, is the transition in your career, intellectual development, from the late 60s to 1982, when you were focused on cognition and the arts, and you published in 1973 your first book, The Arts in Human Development. 1980, you published Artful Scribbles. In 1982, you published Art, Mind, and Brain. So you were very much a cognition in the arts person. And then in 1983, it seems like it came out of nowhere, Frames of Mind, a theory of multiple intelligences, and you are off to the races with multiple intelligences. So I'm sure it wasn't so sudden that you went from arts and cognition to the intelligences person. But could you say a little bit about that? How did that happen that you went through that transition?
Yeah, this is a difficult question to have any distance from because by the time I wrote Frames of Mind, I'd written lots of books and they'd gotten a fair amount of attention, but I just went on to the next book. But Frames of Mind really went viral, a word we didn't have at the time, both in this country and abroad, and particularly in the area of education. And again, to use Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's terms, one does pay attention to the field, and the field, in this case, is everybody else. And if everybody else is interested in what you have to say in intelligence, and many of them are also interested in education, there's a push toward that topic because people want to hear you talk about it. They want to see you write about it. They want to know your next thoughts. So yeah, I did, you might say I was attracted to education and to intelligence rather than distracted or extracted from the arts. But the other thing, to be very honest with you, Ellen Winter, my wife, and many people at Project Zero began to work in the arts. And even till this day, we have many people at Project Zero who are doing work in the arts. At Harvard, at the Graduate School of Education where we teach, there's an arts in education program that would have been begun without Project Zero. So I guess, and this is meant neutrally, I'm the kind of person who likes to start something and then move on. And I wasn't worried that the arts would disappear if I wasn't doing work in the arts anymore. But as you know, and I want to tell your audience this, I revise books. I don't write books anymore, but I blog all the time. And I have hundreds, literally hundreds of blogs available at howardgardner.com. And often I blog about the arts. I might not call it the arts, but it's about music, or it's about a novel that I've read, or about the kind of writing I do, or what it means to be gifted. And so the arts are always something that plays in my mind. And I mentioned earlier that my wife, Ellen, has taken up painting again after 50 years. I play the piano every day. I don't get any better. I don't get much worse. But to me, it's by far the most sustaining and religious thing that I do. And I might forget to brush my teeth or put my hearing aids in, but I don't forget to play the piano. I play mostly, as people would guess, the old classics, but this is a bit of more contemporary stuff. I've been playing Stephen Sondheim, and to my deathbed, I will not understand the appeal of his music. I understand the appeal of his words and of his songs. So as recently as yesterday, I was talking to Claude about whether Stephen Sondheim is successful outside of English-speaking countries. And the answer is much less so, because a lot of his wit is wit that Americans and Brits can appreciate, but it's not going to translate in other parts of the world. On the other hand, John Williams and Lin-Manuel Miranda, who are as contemporary as Stephen Sondheim, I have no problem playing their music because it speaks to me. I think Sondheim's music is not interesting. It's his words that are interesting. And when I'm in a poetic mood, that's fine. But when you have a song from one of his musicals, which repeats the same phrase 40 times, I get kind of bored with it. But do you know his music?
No, I don't.
Yeah, but you know Sweeney Todd and other of his musicals. They're very, very popular, and he's very, very gifted. And he wrote the lyrics for West Side Story, which are brilliant. But he had Leonard Bernstein as the composer, and even Gypsy. I think there was somebody else who wrote the music. He wrote the words. So it was only in the last half of his life that he did music and words, and he was wildly successful. He's beloved by the New York and London crowds, but he doesn't speak to me because I'm trying to understand the music.
I understand. Yes, and you've been a pianist since a very young age, and I know I've read your some of your biographical writings, and thank you for writing those. I highly recommend them. And yes, of course, your blog, howardgardner.com. We'll put that in the episode notes and the description. I'm interested in what you call the synthesizing mind. In 2005, you wrote a book called Five Minds for the Future. And so now we have five minds, and one of them is the synthesizing mind. And you've described yourself this way in an intellectual biography that you wrote in 2020. It's called The Synthesizing Mind, an intellectual memoir. So could you describe what that is and what it means for you and why you think that's the mind for the 21st century?
By the way, I would have said that 10 years ago. I wouldn't say it anymore, but we'll get to that.
Okay. It's no longer the mind for the 21st century.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, I've always realized that I'm good at synthesizing. And I wrote a couple of textbooks, one in social psychology, one in developmental psychology, and a book that I wrote at the same time as The Arts and Human Development was The Quest for Mind, about Piaget and Levi-Strauss, two scholars. And in the introduction to that, I said it was a synthesis. So this is the word that's been in the back of my mind, but it moved closer to the front of my mind when Murray Gell-Mann, who was a great physicist, said in the 21st century, the synthesizing mind is the most important kind of mind. And when somebody like Murray Gell-Mann says something and it seems interesting, you keep it in your mind. So as early as the beginning of this century, when I wrote about minds for the future, one of them that I wrote about was a synthesizing mind. But it was when I began to write an autobiography, which came out in 2020, and it's called A Synthesizing Mind, I realized that even though I'm a multiple intelligences person, that's not a particularly good description of who I am. I'm a rather typical academic, linguistic, logical, mathematical, music as a bonus. How I do in the other intelligence doesn't matter for my job. I'm not expected to dance. But that where I might stand out from most academics is rather than churning out articles on particular topics, my competitive advantage is to take lots of stuff and think about it, rearrange it, and finally put it together in a way that makes sense to me, and then I hope to other people. And so a lot of my writing is what I call synthesis. And so I decided to call my biography A Synthesizing Mind because I thought if I wanted to understand Howard Gardner as a scholar, as a thinker, it's not a personal autobiography, it's a professional autobiography. I would try to understand synthesis. And since then, I've been kind of obsessed with synthesis. If you go again to my blogs, there are dozens of blogs on synthesis. And I think Murray Gell-Mann was right, but he was also wrong. And the reason he was wrong is Murray Gell-Mann, may he rest in peace, thought and wrote before AI and before AGI. And AI and AGI are brilliant synthesizers. That doesn't mean AI and AGI are always right, any more than Murray Gell-Mann or Howard Gardner or Keith Sawyer are always right. You can synthesize and be wrong or off-center. But I do think that what is shocking about these entities is how good synthesizers they are. And when people tell me I think they don't do a good synthesis, I say, do you argue with them? Because one of the things you learn if you have some practice is you don't just accept what Claude or ChatGPT says to you. You say, well, I don't think this, or what about that? And it answers immediately and right away takes into account what you said. It may still get it wrong, but its batting average is at least as good as that of my colleagues and the people whom you talk to and interview on this program. So yeah, I think that synthesis is a great capacity. I'd love to inculcate it in people. Many of my students have become something that almost no other students in psychology become. They become book writers. And books are the best avenue for synthesis, not articles. You can do a brilliant synthesis, but it's books that you do synthesis. And that's why the news item you and I were talking about a few minutes ago about a book that was heralded as great until it turned out to have been written largely by AI. AI is a brilliant synthesizer. So even though I still love doing it and I still want my students to be able to do it, there's a new player in the field. And anybody who's an educator has to be aware of that. And another thing, which is just in the news now, Theo Baker, who is graduating from Stanford this week, he has the fortune or misfortune of being the child of two major journalists in our time, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, has written a book which will be undoubtedly in the top of the bestseller list in the New York Times about AI students at Stanford, where he's graduating this week, and how all of them use AI for everything and don't tell the truth about it. And even if that book is somewhat hyperbolic, and I suspect that it is, we're not going to be able to say to our students, don't use AI, unless we pin them down on an electric chair and monitor their eyes and close down their computers. And that's punitive. That's not. So the educational world and the scholarly world is going to be entirely different because of the synthesizing powers of AI. And when you do a podcast on colleges and universities, we can talk about what I think universities are going to be like in the future, because the work I've been doing for the last 15 years with Wendy Fishman is about colleges and universities, mostly in the United States. We wrote a book called The Real World of College, and about how the mission of college has become completely obscure and abstruse in our time. And so nobody really knows why they're in college anymore except to get a job. And if we're going to have educational entities for people who are 18 or older, they're going to have to be very different than the University of Chicago or Harvard, where you and I went, or to the local state school or community college, or even Arizona State or Southern New Hampshire. The current model just is not sustainable in a world of AI. And in a world where the whole occupational landscape would be unthinkable to our grandparents.
So as we're nearing the end of our conversation, I was thinking that we are the Science of Learning podcast, and your research has had some distance from the field of the learning sciences and cognitive psychology applied to learning, but some productive overlap. But your research has certainly had an immense impact on the practice of education. Every teacher will know who Howard Gardner is. So what message do you have as we're wrapping up for someone who's interested in the science of learning? What would be a message, something that everyone should really know about learning?
Let me get to that in a second, but I've had influence through Project Zero and multiple intelligences, but many, many other people at Project Zero, such as David Perkins and Shari Tishman and Ron and Daniel, many, many people, have had huge influence on education all over the world, particularly K to 12. And just go to the Project Zero website, easy to find, pz.harvard.edu, or to go Ellen's Impact Report, which you can download for free or get from Amazon for $9. And you can read the enormous impact that Project Zero has had on practitioners. And of course, they've had impact also on people who teach in schools of education and people who are work in ministries. But the influences come chiefly from the institutes we run, the summer institutes, the institutes we run on site, whether it's in Australia or Pittsburgh. And so it isn't my influence in education, it's the influence of Project Zero's work. The learning routines, for example, which I'm sure you have run into, I mean, those are used by millions of teachers all over the world. So that's the real influence. The learning sciences, I guess that from my point of view, it's taking the term cognitive science, which has more of a scholarly or collegiate emphasis, and pushing it somewhat more into the educational world. So you said Chris Eady was your first invitee. That makes very good sense if it's the educational world. If it's the people who read the magazine Cognitive Science, if it still exists, that wouldn't be the first person whom you would invite. Roger Schank, if he were still alive, you would invite. So I think it's a bit of a different accent. But what I would say, both to the cognitive scientists and to the learning scientists who are within earshot or eyeball, is that it's a new ball game because of AI. And things which even our great-grandparents took for granted and which we thought our grandchildren would take for granted are just very, very different. What we shouldn't take for granted, and this is the work that I did with Bill Damon and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is the work on ethics and morality. Of course, AI will have ideas about ethics and about morality, and I'm perfectly happy to hear what ChatGPT has to say on the topic. But it's really about our species, human beings, how we relate to other species, how we relate to the natural world, how we relate to the planet, how we relate to the computational world, for that matter. That's what I think we can't give up or resign or hand off or toss to the AIs. And the real challenge, which I wish that people like Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and the leaders of the European Union and the leaders in Asia would talk about, is what do we want for our planet and for the living things in it, not just human beings, but plants and animals, at a time when we have computational entities that are so powerful that they can decide everything. And as you know, but your listeners may not, might decide that the cure for the world is to produce more paper clips and eventually make an infinite number of paper clips and wipe everything out. I think human beings have done terrible things, but we've done lots of wonderful things, and it'd be a shame if that all disappears because AI goes crazy.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. And again, I'm Keith Sawyer, and this is the Science of Learning podcast. And if you've enjoyed our conversation, I hope you'll subscribe and click like. And Professor Howard Gardner, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. And I'm glad not only do we have a chance to talk about lots of things we're interested in, but to reconnect after decades where we've been in e-touch, but we haven't really spent an hour talking.
Dr. Gardner is known for his research on multiple intelligences, but it's really just a fraction of the research he's done and the impact he's had on education and psychological research. He's contributed to our understanding of brain damage, of children's development in the arts, of education in the arts, of morality and living the good life, of effective leadership, of curriculum and assessment, of the future of college in the 21st century. Every one of those topics is worthy of its own podcast interview. It was a special conversation for me because I've known of his research since the 1980s. I first read one of his books then, and that influenced my decision to go to graduate school. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to this channel for more episodes of The Science of Learning.